1.2 million people didn't just vanish into the ether. They actively, desperately fled the state of California since Gavin Newsom took the helm, creating a demographic catastrophe of unprecedented scale. These were absolutely not transient tourists passing through or temporary college students moving on after graduation. They were deeply entrenched, hardworking families who methodically packed up their entire lives, pulled their innocent children out of local public schools, and drove their heavy moving trucks straight across state lines, strictly because the man occupying the governor's mansion had systematically made it economically and structurally impossible for them to stay. The raw financial data was staggering. He had brazenly incinerated $24 billion of taxpayer money on the escalating homelessness crisis, only to watch the humanitarian catastrophe visibly and predictably worsen on the streets. This was the exact same executive who infamously dined in unimaginable luxury at the elite French Laundry restaurant while strictly, hypocritically mandating that the rest of his struggling state eat isolated and alone in their lockdown homes. A man who later had the sheer political audacity to publicly dismiss the massive civilian exodus as a mere right-wing myth. Now, the inevitable reckoning had finally arrived in a silent, tense hearing room. Vice President JD Vance sat directly across from him, heavily armed with the cold, unforgiving numbers, and posed the one inescapable, devastating question that would fundamentally set the tone for the entire explosive confrontation. Where exactly did they go, Mr. Vice President? Mr. Vice President, I appreciate the opportunity. Gavin Newsom began smoothly, projecting the effortless, unshakable aura of a man who naturally assumes every single seat at the table has been specifically reserved for him. He leaned deeply back into his chair, his custom-tailored jacket impeccably buttoned, deliberately resting one hand casually on the table with the ingrained, arrogant ease of someone who has been repeatedly assured his entire privileged life that he inherently belongs in every room he graces, never once harboring a single fleeting reason to doubt that perceived supremacy. His silver-flecked hair was immaculately styled, clearly the meticulous work of a professional, retained specifically for that exact purpose. His suit exuded the exact same bespoke perfection, a garment, loudly signaling that he had a person to manage that aspect of his life as well. Every visible inch of his persona was flawlessly finished, polished, and meticulously maintained to be relentlessly camera-ready, presenting a glossy facade highly reminiscent of how a luxury showroom car is detailed, or exactly how a staged model home is finished, beautifully designed to be admired from a safe distance, yet inherently feeling far more like a display piece than something actually lived in by human beings. I want to start with some context, because context matters in public policy. Newsom declared smoothly, allowing his signature practiced smile to arrive perfectly on schedule. He leaned confidently into his rehearsed talking points, reminding the hushed room that California proudly boasted the fifth largest economy in the entire world, not merely in the country, but in the world, eclipsing even the gross domestic product of the entire United Kingdom. He painted a grandiose picture of absolute dominance, claiming total national leadership in technology, agriculture, clean energy, and the entertainment sector, proudly noting that 1 out of every 8 Americans resided within his state's borders strictly because, as he arrogantly put it, California is where the future happens. Turning directly toward Vance, Newsom's physical movement carried the unhurried, almost mocking confidence of a seasoned political operative who firmly believes his opponent has already suffered a crushing defeat and is simply too ignorant to realize it yet. I respect the vice president, I do, but he represents a state that ranks 47th in GDP growth. 47th, Newsom stated, deliberately allowing his blinding smile to widen by the exact calculated degree that charm artificially expands when it is explicitly being deployed as a weapon, he quickly added that he was absolutely not pointing this out to be unkind, but strictly to provide necessary context, arguing that when a man from Ohio attempts to lecture California on the complexities of governance, it's a little like, and here the weaponized smile fully completed itself. The guy who runs the neighborhood lemonade stand aggressively trying to tell the executives at Coca-Cola how to run their global business. Behind the governor, a loyal staffer visibly adjusted a folder on the table, aggressively projecting the deeply satisfied, smug body language of a subordinate who firmly believed her boss had just decisively won the room by publicly humiliating the vice president of the United States. Yet the vice president held the actual empirical numbers of California's decay right in front of him. The staggering $24 billion evaporated, the massive 1.2 million citizens permanently gone, and one deeply damning internal memo that Newsom's inner circle had desperately prayed no one would ever uncover. Vance sat directly across from the polished Californian, his sleeves practically rolled to the forearm, his glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose, and both hands laid completely flat on the wooden table, palms completely down. The absolute unyielding stillness of Vance's hands served as a brutal, silent contrast to the manicured, hyper-rehearsed polish of Newsom's entire existence. It was a profound physical rebuke that required absolutely no external narration to be felt by everyone in the room. Vance let the condescending lemonade stand insult hang heavy and awkward in the sterile air of the hearing room for 3 agonizing seconds, then 4, entirely refusing to offer a reciprocal smile or visibly bristle at the blatant disrespect. He simply let the insult arrive and sit there, absorbing the tense moment the exact way a seasoned patron allows an outrageous, offensive dinner check to rest on the table before finally calmly picking it up to read the devastating total. "Governor, you're right," Vance finally responded, his voice deliberately quiet, not a smooth Louisiana drawl, nor the cultivated artificial patience of a career senator, but rather the flat, measured, unshakable calm of a blue-collar kid who grew up in a Middletown household where the fluctuating cost of the monthly electric bill fundamentally dictated the entire family's daily mood. He calmly acknowledged the factual reality that California was indeed the 5th largest economy in the world, but stated he needed to append one critical missing number to that grand economic boast. Smoothly opening his organized folder, Vance delivered the blow, 1.2 million. He let that catastrophic figure sit right beside Newsom's beloved GDP statistic, intentionally placing it with the deliberate precision of setting a stark, unfiltered photograph right next to a flattering, distorted mirror. The photograph, Vance silently communicated, depicted undeniable reality, while the mirror only desperately reflected what the governor wanted to see. Vance continued, his tone methodical, stating that a net total of 1.2 million people had actively fled California for other states since Newsom assumed the governorship, and crucially, they had absolutely not left because they were unemployed. Most of these exiles held good jobs, Vance noted, but they were forced to flee strictly because they simply could no longer afford to survive in Newsom's highly touted economy. Vance relentlessly hammered the point home. California's GDP might rank 5th globally, but its very own middle class was completely incapable of paying basic rent. Looking up from his devastating documents, Vance addressed the mocking Ohio comparison head on. "You mentioned Ohio. You're right. Ohio is 47th in GDP growth. And you know what Ohio isn't? Ohio isn't a state people are fleeing," he declared, his voice easily cutting through the manufactured political theater. He vividly described how absolutely nobody frantically packs up a rented moving truck in Columbus at 3 a.m. to drive desperately across a barren desert simply because they can no longer afford to exist in their hometown. Yet, Vance pointed out that exact, frantic, heartbreaking exodus happens in California every single day, a fact he knew intimately because those desperate refugees constantly arrived in his state and personally told him exactly why they were forced to leave. He paused briefly, not to desperately search for a missing statistic, but to deeply summon the memory of his mama. "You said Ohio is a lemonade stand." Mama would have really liked that, Vance reminisced, noting that she had essentially run something very akin to a lemonade stand herself, a struggling working-class household surviving on a meager $11 an hour. But the critical, undeniable difference, Vance emphasized, was that nobody ever had to abandon that household because in Ohio, $11 an hour actually bought a working family a solid roof over their heads, a hot meal on the table, and a decent public school for their children, in stark, horrifying contrast. Vance noted that in Governor Newsom's elite California, that exact same $11 an hour barely bought a destitute citizen a flimsy nylon tent on a filthy, dangerous sidewalk and a crushing 18-month stint on a waiting list for a temporary shelter bed. So yes, Ohio is small and Ohio is quiet, and nobody writes glamorous magazine covers about Ohio, Vance stated, firmly folding his hands tightly together. However, he delivered the ultimate defining truth of genuine public service. The people who actually live there can fundamentally afford to stay there, which, he argued with razor-sharp precision, was the entire foundational point of governing a state. The smug staffer standing directly behind Newsom abruptly ceased adjusting her folders, the earlier arrogance completely drained from the immediate atmosphere. Refusing to yield even a single inch of momentum, Vance seamlessly pivoted to the next unmitigated disaster. "Let's talk about homelessness, Governor." Pulling a crisp page directly from his meticulously organized folder, Vance stated for the official record that Newsom's administration had incinerated a staggering $24 billion on the homelessness crisis since taking the oath of office. Newsom's defensive rebuttal was lightning fast, entirely smooth, and deeply automatic, resembling the slick, pre-programmed reflex of a desperate car dealer aggressively intercepting a question before the wary customer could even finish articulating it. The governor rapidly touted that this massive financial investment had yielded what he categorized as significant, tangible results, rapidly listing off prepared statistics, claiming California had successfully funded 44,000 specific units of housing and had robustly expanded statewide shelter capacity by a full 30%. Vance didn't even bother to raise his voice. The sheer gravity of the devastating facts meant he absolutely did not need to manufacture artificial volume to destroy the argument. With lethal, measured precision, Vance informed the silent committee that while Newsom was busy setting fire to $24 billion, actual homelessness on the streets of California had skyrocketed by a horrifying 31%, whereas the national average during that exact same time frame had actually decreased by 10%. "Your state went up while the rest of the country went down," Vance observed coldly, summarizing the catastrophic failure by noting Newsom had spent the absolute most money in the entire nation only to achieve the absolute worst results. Newsom's left hand instantly shot out in a small, desperate gesture, an open palm, the universal defensive posture of a cornered politician desperately grasping for the safety of context. "With respect, Mr. Bolle," Vice President Newsom countered weakly, insisting that the raw data inherently failed to account for the massive interstate migration of homeless individuals who were supposedly flooding into California, allegedly magnetically drawn by the state's beautiful climate and the unparalleled generosity of its social services. Vance seized upon the sheer absurdity of the defense immediately. So your actual defense, Governor, is that your state is so incredibly generous that homeless people from other states purposely travel to California specifically to be homeless there? A seasoned reporter sitting directly in the packed press row involuntarily exhaled sharply through his nose, producing that distinct, short sound of a journalist who suddenly realizes he has just been handed a monumental, career-defining quote that will inevitably dominate the entire news cycle in 20 minutes. Newsom's perfectly manicured eyes darted leftward by exactly half an inch, exhibiting the subtle micro-gesture of a panicked man frantically scanning an internal mental shelf for the next available defensive statistic. He defensively reiterated that the complex data desperately required nuanced context, specifically regarding the stripping out of interstate migration variables. The context is $24 billion and 31% more homeless people, Governor Vance interrupted with surgical bluntness. That is the actual context. You spent more money on homelessness than any state in the entire history of this country. And the problem demonstrably got worse. Vance then smoothly introduced the financial kill shot, noting that the official state auditor, an auditor specifically appointed by Newsom's own administration, Vance's, had officially concluded that the governor had completely failed to track where the astronomical sums of money had actually gone. $24 billion. And you literally cannot tell the auditor where it is, Vance stated, the massive weight of the missing funds suffocating the room. Newsom's rapid response was visibly drawn from a rapidly depleting mental inventory, far weaker than his polished opening. He awkwardly deflected, claiming the auditor's report merely identified standard areas for improvement, and rapidly assured the room that his administration had already begun swiftly implementing those necessary changes. Vance instantly latched on to the absurd bureaucratic euphemism, repeating the phrase areas for improvement with the deliberate, mocking cadence of a prosecutor, ensuring the jury fully registers the absolute insanity of a defendant's excuse. Vance aggressively eviscerated the corporate doublespeak by invoking his working-class roots once again. Governor, if I handed Mama $24 billion and she couldn't definitively tell me where it went, she absolutely would not call it an area for improvement. She would call it a severe problem, and then she would immediately find the missing money, Vance explained, his tone laced with righteous, blue-collar incredulity. He elaborated that in a struggling household like the one he was raised in, losing $24 billion was absolutely not casually dismissed as a cute learning experience. You either located the missing funds, or the family literally did not eat that week. Pulling yet another damning document from his arsenal, Vance forcefully reminded Newsom of his grand, sweeping promises from the 2018 gubernatorial campaign. Quoting Newsom directly, Vance reminded the silent room that the governor had explicitly promised to end homelessness as we know it. When that audacious, sweeping promise was originally made in 2018, California had roughly 129,000 homeless individuals. Today, Vance pointed out with brutal finality that staggering number had exploded to over 180,000. Setting the official page down, Vance delivered his inescapable verdict. Newsom had absolutely not ended the crisis. He had heavily funded it, constructing a massive, corrupt $24 billion industrial system that actively produces homelessness, while simultaneously losing complete track of the funds and arrogantly dismissing the subsequent mass exodus of citizens as a mere myth. Feeling the narrative slipping entirely from his perfectly manicured grasp, Newsom physically leaned forward aggressively. This was absolutely no longer the relaxed, entitled lean of a gracious host, but rather the desperate, kinetic lean of a cornered politician frantically scrambling for higher rhetorical ground as the earth literally shifted violently beneath his Italian leather shoes. Mr. Vice President, Let me frankly say something about California that I honestly don't think gets said enough in rooms exactly like this. Newsom began deliberately dropping his vocal register to sound profoundly presidential, tapping into a deeply rehearsed artificial cadence that he had undoubtedly perfected in front of countless mirrors until the sheer phoniness of the practice was almost entirely obscured. He launched into a passionate, desperate defense of his state's inherent mythology, conceding that California was admittedly hard, wildly expensive, and deeply complicated, but aggressively arguing that it remained the ultimate pinnacle of the American dream. He invoked the glittering titans of Hollywood, the tech utopia of Silicon Valley, the iconic architecture of the Golden Gate Bridge, and the breathtaking vistas of the Pacific Coast Highway. Nobody grows up in Nebraska dreaming about Ohio, Mr. Vice President. They dream about California. Newsom declared, desperately attempting to reclaim the aspirational high ground. He briefly acknowledged the massive outmigration, but quickly pivoted to praise the elites who remained, characterizing them as the vital engine of the most dynamic, innovative, and diverse economy on the entire planet. He loudly listed off the corporate leviathans that currently dictated modern life: Apple, Google, Tesla, Netflix, forcefully pointing out that absolutely none of these world-altering empires were birthed in Ohio. They were proudly born in California, strictly because California is the sole destination for brilliant visionaries seeking to build things that actually matter. The trademark blinding smile triumphantly returned to Newsom's face, the deeply ingrained reflex of a vain man who had been complimented on his charm so frequently that he had completely lost the self-awareness to realize when that charm had fundamentally ceased yielding results and was now merely projecting empty, hollow arrogance. Vance patiently waited for the fake smile to fully materialize and fade before quietly delivering a devastating, fatal reality check. Governor, the wealthy people who actually built those elite companies can easily afford to live in California. Vance noted, his hands still rigidly planted on the desk. The working people who rigorously clean those corporate offices at night absolutely cannot. He dismantled the governor's romanticized California dream in a single brutal sentence. The wealthy founders comfortably stay, the working class janitors are violently forced to leave, and Newsom was arrogantly sitting before Congress trying to sell the nation exclusively on the founders. Having thoroughly shattered the economic illusion, Vance decisively shifted the active battlefield to the realm of pure, unadulterated political hypocrisy. Governor, I want to formally talk about the 6th of November, 2020. Vance announced coldly. Newsom's chin instinctively rose exactly a millimeter in defensive anticipation. The date was deeply infamous, permanently etched into the collective memory of everyone sitting in the tense hearing room. Newsom immediately attempted to preempt the attack, defensively blurting out that he had publicly and repeatedly addressed the infamous French Laundry incident and had previously taken full accountability. You've completely apologized for it, I know, Vance acknowledged with zero sympathy. But I'd really like to specifically talk about the actual people, Governor, not your carefully drafted apology. Vance began reading the stark, incontrovertible facts with the flat, specific, uncompromising tone of a man meticulously reading a damning receipt to a completely dishonest customer who had been loudly disputing the exorbitant charges all morning. He vividly painted the grotesque picture of that night. Newsom photographed living lavishly at the ultra-exclusive French Laundry restaurant in Napa Valley, surrounded by 12 people from multiple different households, hobnobbing entirely maskless with powerful lobbyists from the California Medical Association. Vance made sure to heavily emphasize the sickening irony that this exact same medical organization was simultaneously funding massive television ad campaigns aggressively commanding ordinary Californians to strap on masks and stay securely locked in their homes, deliberately letting the obscenely high average check of approximately $400 per person hang suffocatingly in the air. Vance brutally juxtaposed the governor's decadent feast with the horrific suffering of his constituents on that exact same day. On that very night, Vance hammered home. Desperate Californians were forcibly prohibited from holding the hands of their dying parents in solitary hospital rooms strictly because of Newsom's draconian lockdown orders. Innocent children had been entirely locked out of their fundamental classrooms for 8 grueling months, and utterly devastated business owners were left staring at boarded-up storefronts, watching their entire life savings evaporate into thin air strictly because Newsom had personally decreed it was simply too dangerous for them to open their doors, setting his glasses completely down on the table for maximum dramatic effect. Vance stared dead into Newsom's panicked eyes. And you were sitting at the French Laundry with lobbyists without a mask at the Patrusuta plate. I made a massive mistake, Newsom offered, the 4 words tumbling out of his mouth with sickening, rehearsed smoothness. The hollow apology completely lacked any genuine sincerity. It had been deployed so many countless times in crisis management scenarios that it had lost absolutely all of its authentic friction, worn entirely smooth like an ancient coin, relentlessly rubbed by 1,000 different desperate hands. I have explicitly acknowledged you made a mistake, Vance retorted instantly, immediately weaponizing the empty apology by contrasting it against the brutal enforcement actions aggressively taken against working-class citizens. Vance relentlessly listed the true victims of the governor's gross double standards. The hard-working waitress in Sacramento who was punitively fined merely for serving hot coffee to patrons outdoors to survive. The desperate salon owner in Los Angeles who was physically arrested by authorities for the absurd crime of cutting hair inside her own private shop. The devoted pastors who were aggressively threatened with actual jail time simply for holding Sunday religious services outdoors in their sprawling parking lots. Throughout this blistering prosecution, Vance's voice never once wavered. It maintained the exact same chilling volume, the exact same deliberate speed, and the exact same flat, working-class Middletown cadence. They strictly followed your mandatory rules, Governor. Every single one of them. The waitress, the salon owner, the pastor, they faithfully followed your rules, and you arrogantly went to dinner, Vance stated, deliberately sliding his glasses back onto his face. Driving the political knife infinitely deeper, Vance contextualized the sheer decadence of the meal, noting that the $400 Newsom blew on a single plate of food was exactly what his mama had desperately scraped together, working 40 grueling hours in a single week at the punishing Armco plant. Newsom had cavalierly blown that massive amount on a single dinner with elite lobbyists without a mask, while simultaneously dictating that the invisible, exhausted woman scrubbing the French Laundry's kitchen wasn't even legally permitted to eat a meal inside her own mother's private home. Turning yet another page in his devastating dossier, Vance smoothly transitioned to another staggering, historic failure of governance. And while we are squarely on the critical subject of massive sums of money that mysteriously disappeared during COVID, Vance began pulling the pin on a massive new political grenade. He noted that Newsom's Employment Development Department had, during the chaotic height of the pandemic, managed to lose an absolutely incomprehensible estimated $33 billion directly to fraudulent claims. He made sure the committee fully grasped the unprecedented scale of the incompetence, $33 billion, officially ranking as the single largest unemployment fraud catastrophe in the entire history of any state, in the entire history of the United States of America. For the very first time since the brutal hearing commenced, Newsom executed a massive, full-body shift in his chair, exhibiting the deeply uncomfortable physical squirming of an arrogant man who suddenly realizes his seat has become infinitely hotter than it was just an hour prior. Sweating slightly, Newsom frantically attempted to socialize the blame, weakly arguing that the catastrophic EDD situation was a complex nationwide problem and that every single state in the union had unfortunately experienced elevated levels of fraud during the unprecedented crisis. Vance didn't even bother to raise his voice to crush the pathetic excuse. Governor California single-handedly accounted for more pandemic unemployment fraud than the next three worst states combined, Vance stated with lethal factual precision. He emphasized that $33 billion was a staggering figure, massively larger than the entire GDP of half the sovereign countries currently existing on Earth. Yet, Vance pointed out with utter disgust the Newsom administration's ultimate response to this historic plundering of the public treasury was absolutely not to furiously fire a single incompetent official, not to ruthlessly prosecute the guilty bureaucrats, and certainly not to offer any honorable resignations. Instead, Vance sneered. The official cowardly response was to pathetically label the historic theft an area for improvement. That specific phrase just keeps mysteriously coming up, Governor, Vance observed mockingly. He systematically tallied the catastrophic failures hiding behind the bureaucratic shield, $24 billion incinerated on a homelessness crisis that objectively worsened an area for improvement, $33 billion outright stolen by blatant fraudsters, an area for improvement. At what specific dollar amount does it legally stop being a mere area for improvement and finally start being categorized as a colossal, unforgivable failure, Vance demanded. Newsom's mouth weakly opened, then snapped shut as his panicked eyes aggressively darted to the left again, frantically executing the exact same mental scanning gesture, desperately reaching blindly into his mental shelf for a saving statistic. But this time, the shelf wasn't merely running dangerously low on inventory. It was completely, utterly, devastatingly empty. His mouth flapped open a second time, managing only to stammer out a pathetic, robotic defense that his administration had since implemented significant, robust reforms to the devastated unemployment system. Vance scoffed openly. You boldly implemented reforms strictly after you had already lost $33 billion, Governor Vance pointed out, once again channeling the raw, undeniable logic of his working-class upbringing. Vance noted that his mama had a very specific phrase for that exact type of useless reactionary leadership. She called it closing the heavy barn door only after the horse had already bolted. Except in Newsom's specific disastrous case, Vance observed, the horse had galloped off with exactly 33 billion taxpayer dollars strapped tightly to its back, and absolutely nobody in the administration had even noticed the colossal theft until the independent auditor miraculously showed up to check the bleeding ledger. Up in the packed public gallery, an older, gray-haired woman sitting quietly with her worn purse resting heavily on her lap visibly shook her head just once. It wasn't a performative gesture for the flashing cameras or the massive room. It was the profoundly private, deeply exhausted headshake of an ordinary citizen who had just heard a financial number far too obscenely large to properly process, and who had simply decided to stop trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the government waste. And just one more crucial thing before we move on. Vance signaled, physically pulling a fresh, crisp printout from his seemingly bottomless folder of destruction. He directed the committee's strict attention back to July of 2025, specifically to a highly publicized appearance the governor made on the popular Sean Ryan show. Vance recounted how the host had directly pressed Newsom about the massive wave of citizens actively fleeing California, directly referencing the staggering 1.2 million exiles. Vance locked eyes with Newsom and coldly read the governor's own arrogant words back to him. The California exodus is a myth. Placing the damning printout flat on the table, Vance let the sheer audacity of the lie hang in the silent room. You blatantly called it a myth, Governor. You stared directly into a camera lens and deliberately used the word myth to describe 1.2 million actual human beings who agonizingly packed their entire lives into rented moving trucks and permanently left your state, Vance stated. Newsom scrambled defensively, aggressively attempting to obfuscate the devastating demographic reality by claiming that recent data showed California actually experiencing population growth over the last 2 years, strictly because of robust international immigration. Vance cut him off with surgical, merciless precision. Governor, not because Americans are moving to California, Americans are actively, desperately leaving California, Vance corrected. He hammered the true demographic disaster. 1.2 million more actual Americans had permanently left California than had moved in from all other states combined. The overall population only technically stabilized because foreign nationals arrived from other countries, not because hardworking citizens from Ohio, Texas, or Florida suddenly looked at Newsom's dystopian economy and decided it was an attractive deal. Folding his hands firmly once more, Vance delivered the brutal psychological diagnosis. Newsom hadn't labeled the exodus a myth because it wasn't factually happening. He cynically branded it a myth strictly because the devastating truth was a massive political embarrassment. Vance sternly reprimanded the governor, stating unequivocally that the 1.2 million desperate individuals who sadly loaded their weeping children into cramped cars and drove bravely across a barren desert fundamentally deserved infinitely better than an arrogant executive who publicly dismissed their agonizing decision as a mere fairy tale. Then, Vance reached deeply beneath the primary folder and smoothly extracted a single, isolated page that instantly, fundamentally altered the atmospheric pressure in the entire room. It was printed on completely different stock, stamped prominently with an internal header, visibly bearing the highly specific formatting of a deeply confidential document explicitly designed to travel strictly from one secure desk to another deep inside a fortified building and fundamentally intended to never, ever see the light of day. Governor, I want to formally read you something your very own office wrote, Vance announced. He explicitly identified the smoking gun as a highly classified internal policy memo originating directly from the governor's innermost sanctum, specifically dated March 2022. For the very first time in the grueling hours-long confrontation, Newsom's trembling hand nervously darted up to his silk tie. The physical adjustment was microscopic, merely a quarter turn of the expensive knot, but it was incredibly profound. It was the very first instance where absolutely anything on his meticulously manicured person had actively required sudden, nervous adjusting. And this wasn't standard grooming. It was the involuntary, deeply primal hand of a panicked man whose body had instantly begun preparing for a catastrophic impact that his mouth had not yet been formally told about. Vance began reading the damning text aloud, his voice echoing loudly in the dead silent room. The housing first approach is definitively not delivering the projected results. Year over year, the official homeless counts forcefully continue to rise despite sustained massive funding increases. Vance continued reading the brutal internal assessment, which desperately recommended immediately pivoting to a treatment first or hybrid model explicitly warning that aggressively continuing the current failing strategy without massive adjustment practically guaranteed the full $24 billion investment would produce absolutely no measurable reduction in the homelessness crisis, while simultaneously creating a massive, highly dangerous exposure to strict state audits. Slowly, deliberately, Vance turned the explosive page over to reveal the devastating climax. He focused intently on the official written response penned by Newsom's own chief of staff, a mere 2 sentences that entirely unmasked the grotesque political cynicism of the administration. Vance read them aloud with brutal, uncompromising clarity. Governor, fully reviewed. He urgently wants to stay exclusively with the housing first model. The $24 billion number is the actual message. Changing our core approach now publicly looks like we were completely wrong. Stay the course. Vance gently set the highly classified page completely down on the wooden table. The $24 billion number is the message, Vance repeated, intentionally using the exact same deliberate speed and the exact same flat, uncompromising voice, ensuring it was permanently etched into the official record. Vance dissected the horrifying political calculus aloud. Not the actual results, Governor. Not the miserable people actively sleeping in squalid tents. Not the 180,000 actual human beings suffering without a solid roof. The staggering number was the only thing that mattered. Newsom's own elite staff had explicitly warned him that his flagship approach was catastrophically failing. They had bravely put the dire warnings directly in writing, urging a desperate pivot, and yet Vance noted with absolute disgust. The governor's explicit, calculated written response was essentially, "The massive number sounds great for the cameras. Keep blindly spending the cash." Locking his piercing gaze directly onto Newsom, Vance delivered a blistering moral indictment. He stated unequivocally that the desperate, freezing people currently sleeping on the filthy sidewalks of San Francisco tonight were absolutely not there because the state of California was simply unlucky, Governor. They were rotting on the streets strictly because Newsom's own staff explicitly informed him the system was fundamentally broken, and the governor had consciously, maliciously chosen the politically convenient talking point over the desperately needed fix. Vance ruthlessly exposed the vain motive. Actually, fixing the crisis would have required Newsom to publicly admit he was dead wrong, and admitting failure would have cost the ambitious politician something vastly more precious to him than a mere $24 billion. It would have cost him his glowing national headline. Vance repeated the damning sequence one last time for maximum destruction. His own staff explicitly warned him the approach was failing. They put it in writing, and his response was that the $24 billion number is the only message. Stay the course. The desperate people dying on your sidewalks are absolutely not unlucky. Vance concluded with chilling finality. They are fundamentally unfixed. Throughout this entire systematic dismantling, Vice President JD Vance remained anchored in his seat, his hands resting flat on the table in a display of immovable composure that served as a silent, powerful rebuke to the performative polish of Governor Gavin Newsom. Vance did not need to shout to deliver his fatal summation. He simply dismantled the governor's carefully curated facade, his perfect hair, his bespoke suits, and his rehearsed talking points to expose the stark, cold reality of California's decline. By contrasting Newsom's elite upbringing in the Getty orbit with his own blue-collar roots in a home where the electric bill dictated the mood, Vance successfully reframed the mass exodus of 1.2 million citizens, not as a myth, but as a direct indictment of failed governance. He ruthlessly laid bare the wreckage, $24 billion incinerated on a worsening homelessness crisis, $33 billion lost to unprecedented pandemic fraud, and internal memos revealing that Newsom's own staff had warned him his approach was failing, yet he chose to prioritize the message of the dollar figure over the actual lives of the people suffering in tents on the sidewalks. As Vance presented the human cost, highlighting the families forced to flee their own heritage because they could no longer afford to live in the state they loved, Newsom's manufactured charm finally buckled, leaving him unable to answer the devastating three-word verdict. What did you do? The subsequent viral explosion of this hearing, viewed over 50 million times, transformed the term Exodus into a national symbol of political accountability, triggering formal audits, brewing subpoenas, and the quiet, desperate reality of families like Carlos and Maria, who found themselves fleeing through the desert in the middle of the night just to survive. In the aftermath, as Newsom stood alone in his mansion, staring at a reflection that no longer matched the reality of his crumbling leadership, the question left hanging in the air was no longer just about California's future, but about how many more political giants, insulated by wealth and hollow PR, would find their own walls of soft governance finally beginning to give way, leaving the nation to wonder who would be the next establishment figure to fall under the weight of the very people they had so long ignored.